and welcome to another episode of America Full Circle. I'm your host, Dana Magellan. Tonight, we look back to the year 1915 in America to examine nativism and the second rise of the KKK. How did it impact the 1920s as it spread throughout the decade? And what were the costs to immigration? And then, America, 100 years later. Where is our nation today? Who are we? And more importantly, who do we want to be? How did nativism encourage white nationalism? And what is its relationship to immigration today? Has America gone full circle? With the 1920s came awareness about health, vitamins, life expectancy, and eating the right foods. The automobile industry saw huge growth. Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line in 1915 allowed the Model T to roll out every 10 seconds, making the cost of a car drop to 3 months' worth of wages instead of 2 years. By 1929, 1 in 5 Americans had a car. The 1920s gave us a front seat to fashion, feminism, and the rebel spirit as introduced to us by the flapper. The Harlem Renaissance was born and burst into every corner of the country to celebrate art of all kinds created by African American painters, sculptors, writers, poets, and photographers. The 20s ushered in the golden age of jazz, the golden age of sports, and Hollywood opened its doors and introduced us to film and theater. In 1920, KDKA, the world's first commercial radio station based in Pittsburgh, began regularly broadcasting, and the first radio news program started in Detroit. Albert Einstein won the Nobel Peace Prize for physics. With all of that, no wonder the decade is referred to as the Roaring Twenties. But some of the roars to come out of the 20s weren't so good and proved to be some of our nation's darkest days. The United States entered World War I in 1917, 3 years after it began, and with that, we experienced division over the war. Anti-German sentiment, which, after the war ended in 1921, we used against German Americans to make them a lesser immigrant class. With Americans divided, the war brought some anti-British sentiment, isolation, pacifism, nationalism, and enthused patriotism. But mostly, we experienced fear. Fear of Bolshevism, which became known to be communism influenced by the Russian Revolution. Communism, something Americans didn't know much about, created panic and fear over anything foreign, anything not native, not 100% American. Fear of our country not returning to normal and of the unknown also existed. The fear even had a name, the Red Scare, and it gripped America and advanced nativism. Carnegie Endowment for International Peace describes nativism as the tendency to define nationhood not by values or laws, but in racial, ethnic, or religious terms. Nativists create second-class citizens based on citizens' characteristics not fitting into their ideology. Ask the dictionary about nativism, and it will tell you it's the policy of protecting native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants, a deep vein of xenophobia. Look even further into its meaning and history, and you'll see it's a sentiment born of fear and uncertainty that undoubtedly takes hostile shape against others, a shape that spirals into white nationalism and gives the KKK a second act. Founded in 1867, the Ku Klux Klan, a national organization deeply rooted in nativism, racism, white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and violence, was centered in the southern regions of the United States. But by the 1890s, the organization was on the decline. 1915, however, saw a rebirth of the KKK. Inspired by the film The Birth of a Nation, former military officer and preacher William Simmons founded what was considered a modern KKK in Georgia. Fundamentally, they were rooted in the same hate ideals, and African Americans remained the primary target. They held strong beliefs in Native, white, and Protestant supremacy and targeted Catholics, Jews, pacifists, and immigrants, just to name a few. By 1920, they had adopted popular slogans, America First, 100% American, and white supremacy, which read on the banners of their flaming crosses. Because they followed the Great Migration, they were not just stationed primarily in the South anymore. They traveled to the Midwest and eventually to every state. The KKK took an ad out in a Texas newspaper in the early 20s that read, "The Ku Klux Klan is the one and only organization composed absolutely and exclusively of 100% Americans who place America first." Edward Jackson was elected governor of Indiana in 1924. Over 30% of white male Indiana citizens were card-carrying members of the Klan, Jackson being one of them. Roughly 55% of Ohio school board members also belonged to the KKK. 35,000 white hooded KKK members marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. in 1927. Their representation of America First, white supremacy, and racial and ethnic terror is cemented with symbols iconic still today. White hood, billowing sheet, fiery cross, and later the adoption of the neo-Nazism arm formation. By 1925, the Klan's membership peaked at roughly 5 million members, and throughout the 20s, those members helped to get hundreds of candidates elected to local, state, and federally held offices. Running parallel to nativist sentiment was anti-immigration sentiment, resulting in legislation that severely restricted immigration. The Immigration Act of 1917 paved the way for additional immigration discrimination in the 20s. It required a literacy test, prohibited most people from the Asian Pacific region from entering, and increased the immigrant tax. In 1921, in an effort to restrict the number of different ethnic groups in the United States, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act. This law reduced admittance from any country to 3% of the population of that country that was already here. Immigration laws were tightened even more in 1924 when the Immigration Act passed, restricting that number from 3% to 2%. The Undesirable Aliens Act in 1929, led by segregationist and anti-immigrant Senator Coleman Bliss, pushed through a law to criminalize Mexican border crossing to limit Mexican immigrant rights. By the end of the decade, the KKK's influence began to decline. In 1933, FDR's administration made lynchings a federal crime. It's important to point out that 3,436 people were lynched in this United States from the late 1800s into and throughout the 1920s. It's also important to point out that the inertia of the KKK's influence and power peaks at different times throughout history. And a final note, Americans watched the rise of Benito Mussolini and his fascist political movement in Europe in the early 20s. His violent movement blended nationalism and populism and caught the eye and admiration of a rising fringe politician named Adolf Hitler in 1922, who went on to update nationalism in his country thanks to the suggestions of Mussolini. As historians, we draw on the past to help inform our today, to gain insight, wisdom, empathy, and a better understanding of the stories of struggle and perseverance, right and wrong, progress and decline, light and dark, as all of it lies within its history. Examining context leading up to and surrounding events is what historians do. It's what people do in situations in everyday life. Identifying World War I earlier, its effects on the Red Scare, which trickled into nativism that helped bolster the rise of the KKK, ultimately had an impact on immigration laws in the United States. This allows us to see how patterns and events are consequential and influential to one another. Nativism, race, and immigration have always been closely related in the United States. As we just heard, the 1920s produced one of the biggest showcases of that relationship in our nation's history. 100 years later, with the 2016 presidential election providing our contextual backdrop, we once again see a sharp turn toward another peak of white nativism and xenophobia. History shows us that it's fear that sets the stage for violence and hate. It wears its Sunday's best and dresses up in nativism, racism, and xenophobia. It engages in violent domestic terror, dangerous conspiracy theories, and shelters political and societal discourse, encouraging deep division. In 2016, the newly elected president, Donald Trump, inhabited a keen awareness of America's fears and ignited them. He stoked the flames of those especially who are marginalized, stuck in cycles of lower income, class, or education, those needing to belong to something, those looking for simple answers to complex events, those with a distrust for powerful institutions of knowledge and information such as government, media, and science. Throughout Trump's presidential campaign, and again in his acceptance speech, he proclaimed that the American dream is dead, again fueling fears and promising that his business acumen and anti-politician prowess would save the dream. Angered citizens questioning if their dream died at the hands of the U.S. government or if it would be stolen by those not 100% American, were given permission by Donald Trump's examples of hateful speech and rhetoric to also speak and act hatefully. He perfected conservative populism to appeal politically to ordinary citizens' fears of threat. Donald Trump adopted the America First slogan and referenced it more than once in his inaugural speech. White nationalist sentiment rose exponentially and has once again thrust us into a heightened nativist, racist, and anti-immigrant, anti-minority movement. In 2019, as president, Donald Trump told 4 congresswomen of color to go back where they came from. In his current bid for re-election for 2024, a new ad campaign for Donald Trump tells us he will make America great for us again. Who is us? This is classic fear-mongering and conspiracy theorist diction that creates an us against them division. Extremist, white nationalist, neo-Nazi hate groups in America today hit an all-time high with the re-election of President Barack Obama in 2012, in which around that time citizen Donald Trump repeatedly and very publicly questioned Obama's U.S. citizenship. Hate groups hit another historic high, totaling 1,021 group organizations in 2018, but have since slowed. The Southern Poverty Law Center reported 733 active hate groups in 2021, down from 940 in 2019. Reflecting on this poses a theory that with Donald Trump at the helm doing all the hate speech for them, white nationalists could perhaps taken a break, sat back and relaxed. Or maybe not. After months of conspiracy theories based in lies from Donald Trump to the American people about a fraudulent 2020 presidential election that was stolen from him, chapters for the white supremacy group, the Proud Boys, almost doubled, from 40 to 72 in 2021. An extremist, pro-Trump organization rooted in nationalism, an organization Trump has never denounced, rather shown his support to, attempted to overthrow the government on January 6, 2021. With the help and urging of Trump and many of Trump's radically conservative advisors, the Proud Boys, along with others, attacked the United States Capitol in an attempt to stop Congress from officially counting the electoral votes. Even after this historical attack on what is our democracy, Trump continues to support the white nationalist group and affectionately refers to the insurrectionists as the Jan Sixers. Trump continues to make false claims that he won the 2020 election with zero proof or evidence. Delegitimizing institutions of knowledge and information like government, media, and science are attempts authoritarian, autocratic dictators make. The past 8 years, Donald Trump has insisted the media is fake news, science is a hoax, and our democratic institutions, which give us things like our free and fair elections, are rigged. Donald Trump has provided the context from his 2016 campaign and presidency that leads us into the 2020s. It is shrouded in white nationalism, conspiracy, and anti-immigrant sentiment. 4 years of the Trump era enacted 472 sweeping executive changes to immigration and deconstructed much of the immigration system. Humanitarian protections were gravely diminished. The Mexican border became increasingly closed off. Trump ran his 2016 campaign on the promise that he'd build the wall to keep the Mexican murderers and rapists out of our country, and that the Mexican government would flip the bill, which they have not. Trump's anti-immigrant policies seem to be the culmination of a long-standing Republican strategy to target immigrants and minorities. Trump's immigration policy success could perhaps be the answer to the question of why do almost 70% of Republicans support him still, even after 2 impeachments, corruption, civil and criminal indictments, scandal, controversy, and an attempted plot to remain in power and overthrow our democratic government. Significant changes were made to the United States immigration system by the Trump administration. What was previously considered fringe politics, Trump's idea that legal immigration was bad for our country, was brought into mainstream politics and enacted with tough enforcement and restrictions. While more people were allowed temporary admittance to the U.S. for work, restrictions set made it difficult for people to stay permanently. An even more significant change to his immigration policy was to lower the number of refugees admitted to the United States. Trump's pledge to enact a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States was realized by severely reducing the quota for Muslim refugees. This proved more effective than his complete ban on Muslim refugees, which was entangled in legal issues. Although the percent of foreign-born people residing in the U.S. increased about 3% from 2015 to 2020, Mexican-born people living in the U.S. has fallen steadily. 2019 saw a startling rise in the number of detentions at the U.S. borders, with families and children separated. The context of Trumpism taking us into the early part of the 2020s sets the tone for increased polarization within our government and in our communities. We recently witnessed Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, two young Black men removed from their seats in the Tennessee Republican-led House for peacefully protesting gun violence within days of a mass school shooting in their state. Their fellow representative and protester alongside them, a white woman, was not voted out. American women watched as their right to choose was repealed when Roe v. Wade was historically reversed. Books are being banned, and "don't say gay" laws exist. There have been more mass shootings since the start of 2023 than have been days in the year so far, yet Congress cannot agree on gun safety laws. In May of 1927, 1,000 Klan members gathered to march in a Memorial Day parade in Queens, New York. Many of them were adorned in their white hoods and robes. Objections from some of the citizens in Queens arose. Fights broke out, which turned into riots. 7 avowed KKK members were arrested. One of them was released. The other 5 were booked. The 7th was a German-American 21-year-old male. Although the New York papers did not identify him as a Klansman, he was arrested, arraigned, and released. His name was Fred Trump. America First is connected to an earlier, very dark sentiment in our country. It is not associated with what many might think it innocently is. This is just one of many examples of why studying history serves to make us an aware, informed, and more conscientious society. The United States democracy is young. It is not impervious to dismantling or deconstruction. As Americans, we must keep authoritarian autocrats out of our government. They exist to serve their own power, their own greed. They do not represent, nor do they serve the citizens of the United States. As historians, we draw comparisons, looking at the praise Hitler gave Mussolini for his effects on nationalism, draws a stark comparison to the praise Trump has offered Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin has been charged with war crimes, and under his authoritarian reign, Russia has experienced democratic decline, human rights violations, and significant corruption. Yet, Trump has continued to declare Putin brilliant and savvy. We close tonight with a startling reminder of some of the beginning signs to fascism. Powerful and continuing signs of nationalism, disdain for human rights, identifying enemies as a unifying cause, supremacy of military, sexism, controlled mass media, religion and government intertwined, corporate power protected, labor power suppressed, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, rampant corruption, fraudulent elections. None of the above belongs in a democratic and free society like the United States. It's imperative that we all do our part to preserve the country we all deserve and love. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of America Full Circle. And a very heartfelt thank you to my editor and producer, Jack Magellan.